Okay, so this last set of slides on training, we're going to talk about some additional specific types of training that are often used in organizations. And finally, we're going to talk about actually how to determine if training has been effective. In other words, the measurement of the effectiveness of training. So training and issues related diversity overview. So basically, there's two types of training programs that are being used by a lot of organizations. One, and the reason these two are being used is both a social justice need. In other words, there is a strong social pressure that organizations should be worried about these issues. There is a legal need for these, in that both of these areas are areas that can actually result in an organization be found, basically brought to court if they're found to be violating various federal laws concerning these. And finally, there is some performance-based reasons for these. Organizations that have less sexual harassment and have better diversity management are also usually more successful. So there's a lot of reasons for sexual harassment training and workplace diversity management training. And we're going to talk about each in turn and how those actually impact how that training is done. So sexual harassment training is basically a training set that basically teaches people the consequences of sexual harassment, and there are widespread implications on organizational work outcomes. Research has found that people that are being targeted with sexual harassment, there is negative psychological outcomes, and there's also negative semantic outcomes, basically physical outcomes. So people being harassed with sexual harassment in the workplace also tend to be overly stressed, which also results in health outcomes. It also has negative effects on the organization. So not only is the person being targeted less likely to be productive, so you're losing money that way. The person or people that are doing the sexual harassment, that's a behavior, that's a time and activity that they're spending, again, where they're not getting their job done. So that's a loss of money to the organization. And additionally, training has found that even the people that aren't being targeted, when sexual harassment is occurring in an organization and it is clear that it's occurring, people that aren't even being targeted or involved also start to lose job satisfaction. They don't like being in that environment. They start losing organizational commitment. They don't want to stay in that organization, and their productivity starts to go down. So there are some real costs to an organization that if it allows sexual harassment to occur. And sexual harassment does sometimes occur. And that's what really drives sexual harassment training from an organizational standpoint, from a monetary. The other issue is again, there is an expectation in the United States culture now that sexual harassment is not something that should be occurring in our workplaces. So an organization that is accused of sexual harassment, that is going to be a negative smudge, if you will, on their reputation as an organization. And finally, sexual harassment is illegal. So if it's occurring, an organization could be not only facing lawsuits, could actually be also challenged by the EEOC. So training may be one of the best tools against harassment, and research has indicated that sexual harassment training is somewhat effective at educating people what exactly is harassment, defining harassment, and giving specific examples of what is and is not harassing behavior. So research indicates that behavioral modeling may help individuals become more sensitive to sexual harassment behaviors, aware of how their behaviors may be being interpreted by others, and males and females view behaviors differently with respect to the potential for being sexual harassment. So that's one of the factors, is sometimes just training men to recognize what you think is harmless may have negative impacts on others in the workplace. So a lot of this is about just giving information about what is sexual harassment legally and what your obligations are. Workplace diversity management and training. So the demographic changes in the workplace necessitate new HR approaches to managing that workforce. What that basically means is that a lot of our HR approaches and a lot of our HR best practices were created at a time where the workforce was predominantly white males. And as more and more demographic changes occurring in the workplace, some of these HR practices may not work as well with a broader group of people. Diversity training is a $10 billion a year industry, and there's a reason for this. 60% of Fortune 500 companies provide some type of diversity training, and the real reason for this is that it's been found through social psychological research that if you take people that are demographically different and just put them together, what generally happens is they'll start to self-segregate. You can walk into almost any high school that is fairly well integrated racially and ethically in this country, and you can look at that lunchroom and you can see the clumps of the different ethnicities. They tend not to intermix even when they're all in the same areas. Now, there'll be some, don't get me wrong, but this is kind of social networking research, and it's been found over and over again. So if you're actually bringing in a diverse group of people, there needs to be a little effort by the company to integrate. And that's the idea of diversity management. And what has been found is that organizations that integrate different demographics do actually have a slight increase to their productivity. It is a business payoff to have your organization be as diverse as the actual client base that you're trying to sell to or interact with. But what has been found is that when there's active diversity management, in other words, a plan and training to incorporate diversity, to encourage diversity, and to get people from diverse backgrounds working together and integrated on teams, you see even a bigger payoff. And that's why it's a big, expensive business, $10 billion a year, and that's why a lot of Fortune 500 companies are now actively investing in this kind of training. And that's just within one country and culture with ethnicity diversity. If you start talking about multinational companies, again, diversity training then takes on a completely new form of trying to deal with people from different cultures working together. And again, just throwing people from other cultures together all in one workplace, you're going to see a lot of interesting self-segregation. You're going to see a lot of conflict, not necessarily a lot of integration. But with successful diversity management, managing that diversity, training people to work together, you're going to see payoffs. So 3 primary objectives in diversity training: increase awareness about diversity issues. So again, just making people aware that different people have different backgrounds and to be open to those different backgrounds. To reduce biases and stereotypes that might interfere with effective management. And to change behavior so that a diverse workforce can be effectively managed. So basically recognizing some of those basic human principles that we tend to hang around people that are similar to us. We tend to group into groups, in-groups and out-groups, and to recognize that you need to work a little bit to break those down. There's been a fair amount of favorable but somewhat limited evidence of the effectiveness of diversity training, but overall the research has been showing a benefit at the organizational level for this type of training. So we're finally going to talk about how do we evaluate whether training worked. So the criteria for training programs are similar to the criteria for the criteria discussed earlier. So once again, we want to ask, is our training relevant? Are we training skills that are actually needed in the workplace? Is it reliable? In other words, if we train one group of people, are we going to see the similar results to the last group of people we trained? In other words, is it stable over different samples taking the training? Is it sensitive? Is our evaluation sensitive? Are we actually being able to distinguish those that learned all the material, some of the material, none of the material? Is the evaluation itself practical? Can we actually do this evaluation? And finally, is it fair in how it measures success of the training? Kirkpatrick came up with a taxonomy that is basically the guiding framework that almost any training and evaluation in IO psychology is used under. And it basically is this list of different things that we can measure. The first one is the reaction criteria, followed by learning criteria, followed by behavioral, followed by results. And this almost maps on perfectly to that definition of training we opened with. The training is about learning that becomes a behavior that results in organizational outcomes. So the first level of Kirkpatrick's taxonomy is reaction. It's literally just measuring the trainee's attitudes. So at the end of this class, if you're sent an online form where you evaluate the teaching of this class, that's a reactions criteria. You're simply being asked, did you enjoy the class? Did you think the class was useful? Did you actually learn anything in the class? Those are your opinions. That's your attitudinal reactions. And that is the that is the easiest thing to measure, but it's also the least useful because it's just basically telling us what you thought of the training. The next level up is a little more useful. Learning criteria. How much is learned? The quizzes and the papers that are assigned in this class are trying to get at learning criteria. That's analyzing how well you actually learn the material. A little more difficult. I now have to actually create basically reliable, sensitive, practical, and fair tests to give you on the material. The third level of Kirkpatrick's taxonomy is behavioral criteria. are there resulting on-the-job changes in behavior based on that training? Now, I don't really have something like that in this class, and most college classes don't. But if we were actually in an organization, we would want to ask, can we get information of, do you actually apply the new behaviors or new knowledge you learned in this training to the organization? And the final level of Kirkpatrick's taxonomy is what we really are interested in. That's the results criteria. Did this training result in increased performance and productivity of the company? So, research on training effectiveness using Kirkpatrick's model has found relationships of about 0.6 to 0.63 as far as correlations between training on each of these criteria, especially when done correctly. So that is a good evidence, a solid amount of evidence that training can be effective. So again, Kirkpatrick's taxonomy, the easiest to measure and the most commonly measured is reaction. Measures the end of the week to determine if participants are pleased with the various aspects of the course. It's an overall evaluation. Learning is measured at the beginning and end of the course to assess if the core competencies and objectives were effectively taught. Self-assessment questions can be in here. Transfer is the evaluation to see if what was learned in the course transferred to practical work. This can be done with maybe a 6 to 12 month follow-up to assess whether these skills are being used, and it might incorporate also the evaluation of the managers when they're evaluating the employees after training. And finally, results. The long-term evaluation of existing or new, this is an example of if you're doing like an obesity intervention, after a year, are people weighing less? If this is a performance-based one, this was meant to create less accidents. After the training, 6 months later, are there less accidents in the organization? So training evaluation, augmented framework, Algers and Company, differs from Kirkpatrick's taxonomy. So this is another model. And basically they say that we can further divide this out a little bit. So reactions are categorized into effective reactions and utility reactions. In other words, what they're saying is that we shouldn't just be asking whether people liked the course. We should also be asked, do they see the course as useful? And that we want to ask both those kinds of questions. Learning has been recategorized into 3 types: immediate post-training knowledge measures, knowledge retention measures, and behavioral skill demonstration measures. So again, the idea of instead of just saying we should measure learning, there's 3 different ways. We can measure learning immediately afterwards. We can measure learning a while later retention, and we can also measure learning through whether those behaviors or skills are actually being done in the workplace. And finally, they called behavioral criteria transfer criteria. Now again, there's only modest correlations between these new criteria above and beyond Kirkpatrick's model, which means there's not a strong argument that this is a better way to look at it, but it does kind of give us another framework. In other words, other ways to think about how can we measure training. So how do we actually use these levels of Kirkpatrick's taxonomy to actually evaluate training? Generally speaking, our evaluation designs are probably going to be quasi-experimental, and they're the most viable alternative for evaluation of training programs. We've got a few here. There's the pre-post test design. It allows for measuring criteria prior to training and again after. And the idea is that if you find that, you don't have experimental control here, but you can at least say, here's where everyone was at prior to the training with the pre-test, and after the training, here is where everyone is at afterwards. If we see an increase, we can use that as an argument that we have pre-post-test design evaluation of training. Now, a better design would be if we could do a control group. So we still do pre and post-test, but now we actually do a pre-test on the people that are taking our training and a group that's not taking our training. So we're getting some experimental control now. And then after the training, we give them all the post-test. So this basically will tell us that if we only find an increase in our training group, it's a stronger argument that training was what actually caused that increase. Because what could happen is we might find that the pre-test and the post-test show an improvement in both groups. That would mean that some other event other than the training had resulted in the entire organization getting more knowledge in this area. A final design that we sometimes see in training and evaluation, and it was specifically designed by IO Psychology as a way to evaluate training, is the Solomon 4-group design. 2 experimental groups and 2 control groups. This is fairly costly, but it's probably the strongest experimental design you can have in a field study setting. And I'm going to just briefly go over an example. So the idea behind it here is that we've got different training evaluation sections. We've got the pre-test, post-test design. We've only got one group. They're measured at time 1, they get the training, and they're measured at time 2. the pretest post-tested group with a control group, we now have two groups, a control group and an experimental group. Both of them are measured at time 1. One of the groups gets training, and then both of them are measured at time 2. The Solomon 4 group design, we have two experimental groups that are going to get the training and two control groups. Experimental group 1 and control group 1 gets pre-testing. Only the experimental group gets training, and then at time 2 they both get the post-test. At the bottom we have experimental group 2 and control group 2. They don't get a pre-test. Only the experimental group gets training, and again they're given the post-test at the end at time 2. What this tells us is, unfortunately, whenever you take a pre-test, you also learn some of the information from the test itself, which means that we would expect in a Solomon 4 group design that what we're going to find is that the increase from time 1 to time 2 for the control group 1 is going to be slight. There's going to be an increase. Control group 1 saw the pretest. They took it, so they know what information they're going to be tested on. And when they're tested on it again, it's going to be more familiar. We'd expect a little bit of an increase. We would also expect that experimental group 1, who saw the pretest and got the training, will also do a little bit better in addition to their training. So what we're going to find here is that control group 1 is going to show improvement. Their test 4, M4, their time 2 test 4, is going to be higher than control group 2's M test 6. So looking at the far right, we have those 4 post-tests. End of the training or end of the session for the control groups. In a Solomon 4 group design, if the training is really what caused the improvement, we're going to see multiple trends. We're going to find that both training groups are going to have the highest means. Experimental group 1 is actually going to have slightly higher means than experimental group 2 because they got the training plus they had seen the actual post-test prior to taking the training. So not only did they get the training, they got familiarity with the test. And likewise, control group 1 and 2, their means, mean 4 and mean 6, should be lower than either of the training groups. But again, control group 1 should be a little bit higher than control group 2 because again it had pre-exposure. When you find that pattern, that's a strong indication that the only thing that could have been finding that particular pattern was the effect of training. So this is just a visual guide again of what we've got here is we've got two different experimental groups. One of them gets the pretest, one of them doesn't. Both of them get the treatment, and both of them get the post-test. And we have two control groups, one with the pretest, one without the pretest, and both of them take the post-test.